Let me welcome all of you to this session on what would happen to a world without the WTO. And to begin with, we thank the World Trade Forum for giving us this opportunity to organize this session during the World Trade Forum. And I'd also like to thank the four speakers who have agreed to speak on this particular session. First is MEP Bernd Lange, who will not be coming in person, but has sent us a videotape because of a sudden meeting which has come up, which is more urgent, more parliamentary business. Emily Jones, Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Lange School of Government and University of Oxford. Kimberly Botwright, she should be joining us any minute. She's community lead on global trade and investment at the World Economic Forum. And my colleague, Bipul Chatterjee, who is the Executive Director with CUTS International, as well as the head of our Center on Trade, in the trade environment and trade, international trade, economics and environment. Now, this is a series of webinars that we've been doing around. This is probably the seventh, and Bernd himself has spoken at one of them on a session on which we are producing a discussion paper as well, which will be out as soon as we're able to get comments from everyone, which includes Bernd. There's no doubt that the multilateral trading system is undergoing a crisis. This is exacerbated by the fact that the traditional trading powers are not taking enough interest in the functioning and progress of the WTO. We're carrying two hooks, as it were. This is evident at two levels. If you look at it. In all the three functions of the WTO, negotiations, deliberative, and dispute settlement, and in a plethora of bilateral and regional free trade agreements which are happening outside the multilateral trading system, I beg your pardon, outside the WTO system. It seems that most of them are more interested in taking forward their trade interests through non-multilateral means. This is also true for traditional middle powers as well as emerging powers. Given this nonchalance to the functioning and progress of the WTO since April this year, CUTS International has organized a series of webinars on this topic, what would happen to a world without the WTO. A number of eminent speakers such as Pascal Lamy and Suprachai Panesh Pakri, former Director Generals of the WTO, spoke at these webinars. Following are some key points, some highlights of conclusion and recommendations which emerge in these seminars, which we need to ponder over in this particular session. As an aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, a new world is going to unfold, and we don't know as yet how it would look like. Multilateralism per se, and trade multilateralism in particular, is under a very serious threat. The question is how to deal with this threat when it is needed the most. The WTO is in a ventilator, it has to come out of it. Second, a more pertinent question may be that given the dysfunctional state that the WTO finds itself in today, what would happen to the world as a whole, not just trade? We may witness a deep recession, including a food crisis. We have to keep on working on ending this pandemic, including a Marshall Plan kind of an approach to particularly help the poor countries. From our experience of past disruptions, the world will recover when the global trading system recovers. Recent drop in imports to China is much more alarming than the decline in exports that they're witnessing. Should it not be that the WTO brings back an order to a chaotic world? As a result of the COVID-induced disruptions, the rules-based and open multilateral trading system will be even more challenged. There has to be a balance between market access needs and regulations related to ensure safety and security for consumers and their livelihoods. More importantly, as against policy-induced distortions to trade, we are now witnessing physical obstruction to trade. This calls for a new global initiative by recalling the genesis of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. The traditional trading powers will have to take this initiative, and middle and emerging powers like India will have to join it with full vigor. It is time for a new global compact. In order to preserve global peace, we have to encourage trade. The fundamental threat to the global trading systems comes from the fact that the United States has lost its confidence in various spheres of life, particularly cultural confidence. By contrast, China is much more confident than ever before. As a result, the more China supports anything, the US is expected to say no, and there may be a bipartisan support in the US for this approach. It is also important to underline that the crisis of globalization in general and international trade in particular is a result of inequalities, as hyperglobalization, as we witnessed since early 1990s, largely ignored the needs of the marginalized and the poor. This resulted in populism in various avatars, with shifting power dynamics within and across countries. The COVID crisis exposed the inherent contradictions in the WTO-led trading system, which was already asymmetrical in nature. As a result, we are seeing increasing instances of export restrictions and also reshoring. The impact of this shift on poor countries will be severe due to a double whammy of facing adverse terms of trade in respect to their commodity exports, as well as increased imports due to food crisis in particular. We really need to interrogate the whole process of the functioning of the WTO. This will help us to have a better understanding of why there are so many systemic challenges. The rules-based multilateral trading system continues to be the best option, particularly for the developing and small island economies. While the WTO is an improvement of its predecessor, the GATT, it is not a perfect system. The WTO as an organization had and continues to face some significant systemic challenges. Most importantly, the recent trade disputes between major members have put considerable pressure on the system to function in a better manner. Without the WTO developing and small economies will face more challenges, and it is that forced them to call for reforms of the WTO by taking into account the current geopolitical situation. Furthermore, the COVID-induced crisis has challenged the confidence in cooperation which underlines trade. Not just the decline in the volume of trade, we need to understand how has that undermined the values of the multilateral trade system. This lack of confidence in global cooperation is worrisome. This is expected to get reflected in future governance of the global health system, including how the expected vaccine to prevent the COVID-19 is going to be administered or distributed. This is where the flexibility of the multilateral trading rules will be useful. We need to see how smoothly that is done. We need to reinvent the WTO through structural transformation so as to derive better value out of it through a more balanced but faster decision-making process. This is an imperative in a post-COVID world. We need a better global leadership. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the middle and emerging powers, including India, to collectively provide a strong leadership for the resurrection of the multilateral trading system. They have done so in the past, and it's time for them to do again. Therefore, other than debating the broader role of the WTO in underwriting peace, stability, security, and prosperity, we need to have an immediate focus on the following three doables for trade multilateralism under the aegis of WTO to reinvent itself in a new avatar. Number one, revival of the built-in agenda of the existing WTO agreements by advocating for greater transparency in the functioning of the WTO's committees, particularly to deal with sudden disruptions to trade and supply chains, such as those emanating from the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, absorption of the values of the WTO agreement on trade facilitation for future multilateral negotiations so that countries at various levels of development are more comfortable in making commitments as per their capabilities and needs. And third and last, reforming the WTO's dispute settlement system particularly the functioning of its appellate body as suggested by the US Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. He one stage process with the review mechanism, but by also taking into account the concerns of other trading powers, including middle and emerging powers and the poor countries. Today's webinar is the last in the series. Like before, we have an eminent panel of experts. I would particularly urge them to speak about possible way forward for the multilateral trading system to come out of its current dysfunctional state. With that, let me welcome you all once again. And as I mentioned, I noticed that Kimberly Botwright has also joined us. Welcome, Kimberly. Hello. Oh, hi. There you are. Right. Pleasure. Let me, as I said in my opening remarks, Mr. Lange is unable to participate, but he sent a video, a short video, which I would like the organizers to please show us.
Okay, we're starting it now.
Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, I'm not able to be really with you today because I have to make some really important commitments here in Brussels on some trade-related legislations. But nevertheless, I would just give some thoughts to you to this really important question, how a world would like without WTO. To thank first the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for organizing this panel, which was planned originally, of course, in Geneva at the Public Forum. I'm convinced, ladies and gentlemen, that in this corona pandemic, a tendency is quite often on the table, the tendency of protective measures. We have to recognize that in the context of corona pandemic, more than 150 new protective measures were established worldwide. And one big trading partner, the United States, are not respecting international trading law anymore. And this leads to serious disruption in trading relations and also in the question of employment worldwide. So this tendency, I think, make really clear that we need more and stable international rules. So the world without WTO would really look like a mercantile system we had 200 years before, without any stable relation to each other, without any possibility to fight against poverty with stable trade relations. And therefore we need really to have a reorganization, a re-regulation of globalization through the WTO and the rules. We should really find a way to modernize the rule book, because since the foundation of WTO in 1994, of course, the development has gone on, and we should really reflect which additional necessities we have. Of course, we have to reflect on the digital side, how we can use the digitalization in improving trade relations and also improving employment situation worldwide. In this field specifically, I think there is a chance for developing countries. We have also to reflect how to improve the intellectual property rights in the interest of developing countries. We have to really reflect how we can have a more balanced and fair situation between state-owned enterprises and private enterprises. And of course, the question of the Paris Climate Agreement and also the question of labor rights or sustainability has to put on the table of WTO as well. So there are challenges, but I'm totally convinced that at the end of the day, we will have only a chance if this system WTO with the two-step dispute settlement mechanism with a binding appellate body is the only way going forward. But of course we have to modernize this. We have to re-regulate globalization based on a rules-based trading system. Thanks a lot and all the best for you.
Let me thank Mr. Lange in his absence, and I think some of his staff members will probably be attending this session. And with that, let me turn to Emily Jones. 5 to 7 minutes each. Our total session is 1 hour. And I beg your pardon if I took a little longer time in my introduction, because it was important for me to narrate the outcomes of our 6 webinars that we held. Emily, over to you.
Thank you very much, Pradeep, and it's a real privilege and pleasure to be with you all and to discuss what I think is a really important debate. So what I wanted to do with my time was to really flesh out some of my concerns, I guess, with where the starting point for the reform debate is at. So let me just start by saying, of course, I fully agree we need a rules-based order. Without the WTO, we all face a very big problem. We're seeing it play out in front of us, of very much a bilateralist approach, a transactional approach, and a very much one that's based on sort of naked power politics and sort of race to harmful beggar thy neighbour policies, which I think we all have a common interest in constraining. I think you've already mentioned, Pradeep, the importance of the multilateral system, particularly for smaller developing countries who are, of course, most trade dependent and vulnerable to shocks. The multilateral system provides a seat at the table, which bilateral fora don't, often a means of exerting influence, and of course, when it's functioning, an important mechanism for enforcement. So there are huge value in maintaining the WTO at the core of the multilateral trading system. And I think the current reform debate is really important, and then of course it's a long time coming. So what I wanted to do with my time was just to ask us to all step back from the reform proposals and just ask ourselves what exactly is the starting point for the reform debate. And that might seem a little bit odd, but let me explain. And my concern here is I think we often talk past each other because I'm not convinced that we all have a common understanding and agreement on actually what the WTO is for, and therefore the type of WTO that we need. So we end up talking about sort of revision or reform proposals on bits of the system, and I wonder whether actually we need a higher level debate to agree on some of the basics. And why do I say that? And just having read through in the last few days some of the more recent discussions, and there's some excellent contributions and ideas in there, but on WTO reform. But I've come away with this understanding that really a lot of the reform debate is still premised, and particularly of course ideas coming from the US, but not only the US, but on making China play by the rules. And a presumption that there's a common understanding about the need for market opening and regulatory convergence. And it's rarely stated as clearly, but I think it's still there. And I think it's problematic for 3 reasons, and I think the world moved on from that common understanding, if indeed it was ever a common understanding. So first, I think there was, as many have stated, there was an assumption that when China joined the WTO that it would over time converge on a liberal market economy model. Of course it hasn't. We've seen that. And much of the reform debate is really about how do we get China to play the game, to play by the rules. And I don't want to downplay by any extent the serious distortions and harmful spillovers from China's approach. But something I think we often forget, though, is that China's grown incredibly rapidly through these very non-conventional policies. Yes, there's been negative spillovers from that, including for the environment, displacement of jobs in some countries, distortion of global markets. But we've seen a dramatic level of growth and poverty reduction that we really haven't seen elsewhere. And for many countries and for many governments, they're looking to China's experience and saying, well, how can we emulate that? Which bits can we translate? Are there things that we can do to spur growth in our countries? And often that really is there's a sort of an approach that's out of sync with the liberal market-based philosophy that underpins much of the WTO agenda. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And China is seen as a problem, certainly from the US and to some extent the EU. But I think a lot of other countries are actually looking to emulate China. So we do have a fundamental question that raises. The second point is just the practical reality, of course, has moved on even in pre-COVID times in many Western countries. So we're seeing a real recalibration of relations between the domestic policies and the global economy. The UK is a very good case in point with our Brexit. We've seen the populist movements elsewhere, and of course in the US as well. So governments in major economies, Western economies, are no longer pursuing a particularly liberal economic agenda in the same way that they were before, and it's really unclear to me that their citizens are behind such an approach. And of course it's most obvious in the US, where we've seen a really strident nationalist turn, and we've seen economic security concerns to come to the fore. We can think about discussions over Huawei investment screening. In Europe, as we've just heard from Bernd Lange, we've got these concerns about aligning social and environmental values with economic integration. So there's a big question about how countries engage with the global economy. And of course, with COVID, we're now seeing state intervention in a way that we really haven't seen in Western countries pretty much ever before. And it's incredibly important to get us through the crisis, but the subsidies are then very distortive. So again, it's not clear that the Western governments at the moment are really playing by a sort of, or buying into a liberal market order either. So I think we're at a really important point of recalibration, actually, in the way that we manage our relationships with the global economy. And of course, we also need to think about where developing countries are coming from when they see the reform agenda. And I know a lot of people are tired of sort of saying, oh, we don't want to go back to the Doha agenda and the unfinished agenda of Doha. But again, there's a long-standing frustration on the part of many developing countries that the concerns haven't been taken seriously. It still confounds me that we haven't found a way to address cotton subsidies, for example. So we need a system that everybody can buy into. So we need a trading system that really grapples with this very different relationship, I think, that we're, or moment in time that we're at. So I think we need a sort of this big conversation to happen, and to ensure that we've got buy-in from everybody on actually what the purpose is and the primary purpose of the global trading system. So getting out of our echo chambers is really important. So we're very good at holding conversations among those of us who sort of believe in the merits of the system as it stands. The vital thing for me is to have these very quite uncomfortable conversations with people who see the world very differently. But unless we bring them into that conversation and create a system that everyone can buy into, it's not going to be a stable system. So just a couple of then concrete points. One is to really, I think, enunciate this idea that we want a system that's not about deep harmonization and convergence on a common set of rules, but actually is about enabling countries to pursue different approaches to managing their economies and to find ways that we can do that peacefully. And of course, and vital, is to then focus on finding practical ways to limit harmful spillover effects. So subsidies, etc. That's a really important agenda. But what I think it does mean is de-emphasizing the need to sort of create new plurilaterals, to create new rules and focus on market opening. I really do worry that that will further balkanize the system and further marginalize those who are already marginalized. It's obviously important that we provide stability and predictability, and I think everybody's on board with the idea of solutions to the appellate body problems, and the Walker proposals I think are eminently sensible ones. So there's a clear agenda there and a way forward, of course, politics aside, but I think that's worth pursuing. But the final point I wanted to make is just that the WTO is an incredibly valuable forum. It's about the only forum we have that's avowedly multilateral, where everyone's got a seat at the table in the global. It's sort of the only global economic institution with that feature. So if we think about tax reform, which is an urgent agenda, it's being led by the OECD, right? So that's not such an inclusive forum. Again, instead of focusing on the negotiation of new rules, can we create space in the World Trade Organization for actually brainstorming new ways to collaborate, to tackle really systemic problems that we face, whether that's COVID, whether that's climate change, instead of focusing very narrowly on the negotiation of new rules. Think of it as space, creating more of a space for sort of collectively brainstorming and finding collaborative and cooperative ways forward.
Thank you, Emily. That was an excellent oration, I would say. What does come out from your point, your viewpoint, as well as those expressed by Lange, is one thing which we must remember, and we often forget, that this is not a homogeneous world. It's a highly heterogeneous world. So you have a small country with very limited economy, limited understanding, with a large economy, and then two large economies are fighting, and therefore something like when two elephants fight and the grass gets trampled, and that is what is happening in the WTO, to be precise. Now, what is pointed out about China is certainly one of the factors that US had got its, Trump had got his sort of arms up against it because of the kind of state subsidized system which allows them to be competing unfairly. But that is one aspect. The other aspect is that even the US has not been a very good international citizen in many ways, getting not endorsing the climate change agreement, for example, getting out of the WHO and so on and so forth. So we are in a system where there is a lot of fragmentation which is happening. And one important point which Mr. Lange made in the context of harmonization between various issues, he spoke about the importance of IPRs, or the kind of difficulty which he hinted at, the difficulty which the developing world are having. And that is again a very important thing to see. And interestingly, as you know, I mean, most of the bilateral agreements that the US enters into, they get a TRIPS plus commitment from the bilateral. So ultimately, another reason why the multilateral system is far better than being pursued bilaterally. With that, let me come to Kimberly. Kimberly, over to you.
Great, thank you
5 to 7 minutes.
Thank you so much. And
Kimberly, just a minute. I just wanted to tell the audience that they could, any questions that they have, they could please put it through the Q&A, and we'll respond to them. I'll respond to them through the various panelists. Over to you, Kimberly.
Absolutely, great idea. Always good to have questions. Thank you so much, and an absolute pleasure to be here. So I'm going to pick up on what Emily was saying around what is the purpose of the WTO and what is it for? And I've also been asking myself this question over the past year as it's been going through its various challenges. And I think one thing that's sort of an interesting thought exercise to do is to go back to the Marrakesh Agreement and look at what its objectives are and what those were stated as in 1995. So we do find some objectives there, and those include that trade relations should raise living standards, that it should be about the optimal use of resources with the objective of sustainable development. It was actually one of the earliest references to sustainable development. And it should also be about supporting developing country trade. And again, this is particularly thinking at the multilateral level. Further, that the WTO's objectives are about creating the space for countries to enter into reciprocal and mutually advantageous arrangements to reduce tariffs, other barriers, and eliminate discriminatory treatment. And finally, preserve the basic principles and to further the objectives underlying the multilateral trading system. And that, I think, is quite important, indicating that the WTO is really at the center of a universe of then concentric circles that form the various arrangements that countries use to trade with each other. That broader universe obviously includes a huge range of investment treaties, includes bilateral, regional, and so on and so forth. And I'll come back to Emily's point about how then trade should be interfacing with other forms of economic cooperation in a minute. So then I think it's important to do a little bit of a temperature check. So how well are we doing quite some years on against these objectives? So has the WTO met its objectives, or have, rather, I think a more correct way to put it is, have WTO members used the organization effectively to meet these objectives? Because the power does lie with countries and with members. So on living standards, it's relatively complex to assess, but we can broadly say that the Uruguay round, and if you combine that with NAFTA, generated an increased purchasing power of up to $2,000 per year for the average American family of poor. Meanwhile, over in Asia, absolute poverty has fallen from being around 60% average in the population in 1975 to around 20% today. So it's just two snapshots from East and West, but on average, living standards have gone up since the conclusion of the Uruguay round. Sustainable development, they're less good. Biodiversity loss is accelerating. Current climate policies are likely to result in a 3.2 degrees rise above Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and over 33% of the world's fish are harvested at biologically unsustainable levels. In terms of developing country trade, LDC share of merchandise imports was around 1% in 2009, which almost doubles the share held a decade earlier. Further, as of 2018, world trade volumes have expanded 4.2 annually on average since 1995. That's on average. Whereas for developing countries, it was 6.3 and 3.1 for developed countries. So some interesting statistics there. Tariff reductions, there have been some general drops in MFN. Other barriers done less well there. We're sort of doing okay on the tariffs, MFN's down, but in terms of tackling the other types of barriers that pose a brake on trade, there I think we can all agree that there are all kinds of new NTVs and various challenges that come up. So going forward from this, I think then we have to set it in the current context of geopolitics. So can the system continue to work on those objectives, which I guess the scorecard is some good, some bad, but then you have to layer on the new context that we now live in, which I think Emily described quite well, that we're moving away from rules-based order, we've gone back to kind of naked transactionalism. I think some of that was probably around before, but at least the big powers pretended to play by the rules, whereas now I don't think they're pretending quite so much. We're also seeing extrajudicial reach becoming much more popular, being deployed by the US, the EU, and China. So again, that really gets us into a very different type of space. Can the system deal with the type of tensions that we're going to be seeing coming up around the digital economy? Can they deal with the types of tensions that we will inevitably see come up in the context of COVID-19 and the enormous state interventions that are going to be made to keep economies afloat? And can it, to pick up on what the EU just said, can the system deal with the types of protective measures that will inevitably be put in place, also due to fears around the loss of economic activity around COVID-19? I am not sure that this current system can. I am not entirely sure what the best way forward is for that. But again, I think somewhere in the answer lies in further unpacking to Emily's point, is how much do you go plurilateral versus multilateral? There, I think, I'm not sure it's helpful to, personally, I'm not sure it's helpful to spend too much time debating on which option you choose. I think rather it's which option do you choose for what purpose? So perhaps you go plurilateral if you're starting to talk about binding arrangements, but then I would very much agree with Emily that in the multilateral front, the WTO committees still remain a really important place for exchange and dialogue on economic policy between nations. And so maybe those are spaces where you agree that you need to continue that dialogue and agree that they need to address certain issues. How you come back to some of these really key areas for particularly for developing country trade, such as around agricultural subsidies, special and differential treatment, in all of this background and context I've just provided, that is the million-dollar question. Again, I don't think it will be solved by refusing to engage in some of the new issues, because I think those new issues are there. I think those have to be engaged with, but simultaneously need to keep the pressure up on some of those other aspects too. Essentially, I think we're looking at a more complex, more advanced organization than the one that was born in 1995. And that's not a bad thing. Lastly, what I will say is I think in all of this, the WTO, I don't think it's about necessarily rebuilding it or recreating a whole new thing. I think it's about evolving it. So as I just said, it becoming a more complex organization, but equally, and in addition to this, it really needs to interface better with other economic policy areas. So I think there needs to be much greater dialogue between trade policy experts and financial system industry experts. Trade finance is one of the major issues within the context of COVID-19. Very little interface is happening between the relevant policymakers in this respect. And supply chains are really facing a big challenge in this area. Climate change, this is, if we don't align economic policy and trade policy with the goals of climate change, we will not meet them. Lastly, on tax, I would slightly disagree with Emily. I do think the OECD process, although the OECD is only the 34 economies, that particular tax process has been opened up. I think 110 economies are participating. Nonetheless, I do think it is relevant to enable those types of interactions. And I absolutely would agree with you that we cannot have the WTO just operating in a bubble, that they only do trade policy, because I think, as the interventions have shown so far, trade policy now goes well beyond a kind of simple black and white characterization of what we thought of it, of what it was before. So I think to rebuild or refix or move for the WTO, it's got to become more complex, and we've all got to evolve with that. Thank you very much, Pradeep. Back to you.
So, yeah, thank you. I said thank you very much, Kimberly, and let me again an excellent presentation. I have two interesting questions from the audience, which I would like to raise to all the panelists, including for Bipul Chatterjee to respond to in his concluding remarks. We have another 15 minutes to go, I would imagine. Now, if the panelists consider all of the various benefits that might potentially come out of the WTO and are forced to choose just one to place at the head of that list, what would that be? What is the meta principle that necessarily precedes, organizes, and enables all the others? Does anybody think that it is not agreements shall be kept? Pacta sunt servanda, the Latin expression of which I'm ignorant. What is the point of making agreements if they're not going to be honored? That is one. The other question which came from an anonymous attendee was directed to Emily. Is it, can you suggest, I mean, what would be an alternate if the WTO were not to exist? How would trade deals, trade relations be governed, etc.? And Kimberly, you can also respond to that. So let me start with Emily on both these questions. Emily? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So, sorry, I was expecting we would hear from Bipul, so I was just mulling over those comments, but they're important, and thank you, Kimberly, as well, for engaging with the discussions and some of the points I raised. So I think you're absolutely right. I think unless we have a system where we have a dispute settlement mechanism that works and everyone is seen to uphold, then it's very, very hard. Like, that seems to me to be the absolute core of the system. I think the rulemaking agenda is a more contentious one, and I think that's the more problematic. But just having being able to uphold a system where agreements are kept, I mean, I fully agree with you on that. I'd be interested to hear what others think. On the in the event the WTO isn't able to survive the test of time, is there any other organisation that could possibly take up the role? I guess the G20 would be probably the closest group that we've got that genuinely brings the different players, many of the different players together. I also think we'd seen a dynamic that moves regional. So if you think within the African continent at the moment, there's a lot of energy around the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So I think things would probably go regional, and then you'd see the G20 as a sort of the space where a lot of these bigger economic questions are discussed. Of course, that doesn't provide us with the the dispute settlement mechanism and the sort of agreeing and keeping to the rules function that James asked us about. So I think it would be hard to replicate that, and I think it's a really important the core of the multilateral trading system.
Kimberly, over to you.
Great, thank you. Fully echo Emily on the first, and in a sense, when we think about those various benefits, if we set aside the sustainability element and just think about economic development, GDP growth, that stability that the system has provided and the layers it goes back to with the appellate body, that is what gets business to invest overseas, because they know that once a commitment has been made, that provides a level of certainty. Now, I think business will probably invest anyway if that certainty goes away, because business wants to move forward and they want to keep growing and making deals. But will they invest less? Yes. Will it be less clear to governments on how to attract various types of investment and how to grow their economies in a certain direction? Yes. So for those reasons, I think that is the really key benefit of the system. Then what would replace the WTO? Again, it will be, if the WTO is at the core and then there's various outer circles, it'll just be that you don't have a core. and that the various outer circles will continue to function, but how well they interface with each other, and again, I guess also importantly, the various opportunities, particularly for smaller countries, will be challenging for companies that are forced to choose between one system or another, between that complying with that regional block standards or that regional block standards. You sort of somewhat see that already anyway, but at least the WTO provides this kind of very basic MFN level of openness in some areas.
Thank you. Bipul, why don't you also comment on it and you come back to your vote of thanks later. Bipul, please.
Sorry, yeah. Thank you, Pradeep, and let me also thank Emily and Kimberly and of course Mr. Lange for their remarks or for their thoughts.
No, Bipul, you can come to the vote of thanks later. Why don't you first join the debate?
Yeah, as coming to this, the questions which have been raised, I think what is needed is that we tend to forget this founding objectives of the multilateral trading system, and that is where much of the problem lies, as Kimberly has rightly pointed out. Therefore, the question is, how can we revisit them and reorient them, rather, in order to take into account these various concerns which are arising, not just because of COVID, but even before that. So, but I don't see that whether it will be possible to do it in the present system of governance. So we need a new global compact, and it's not just about the government and the private sector which needs to play their role, but importantly, we need to engage with communities to come to a new sort of equilibrium for this system to move forward. So let me stop here for the time being.
No, can you answer the question that can you think of an alternate system if the WTO is not to exist?
There are a number of systems there. I mean, we see these regional economic communities, bilateral agreements, but I don't think that they are alternate to the multilateral trading system under the WTO. So instead of thinking about an alternate system, I think we should make our efforts to reform the existing system. How are we going to do it? That's the question that we need to answer. I really don't think that we can think about a totally alternate system which is going to help us in taking forward the agenda of trade reform along with reduction in poverty.
Right. Thank you, Bipul. And if there are any other questions that Emily, you would like to raise, yeah, please. Emily.
Thank you very much. So I had one question. I would love to hear the thoughts of attendees as well as my colleague panelists, and that is whether now we're actually in a situation where we need to acknowledge that governments will be more interventionist, and actually not seek to hinder that, or only seek to hinder that when it has negative spillover effects. So actually to allow much more space and sort of allow countries, if you like, and governments to distort the economy. For example, I think Kimberly, you've rightly said the enormous challenges we face around climate, diversity. Unless we distort the way that markets operate and give them different sets of incentives, we're not going to actually tackle the challenges head on. But that's a very different way of understanding actually how we achieve the Marrakesh objectives. I don't know if that makes sense. I think we've got the Marrakesh objectives that really set us out there, say we want to raise living standards, we want to support development, we want to support sustainability. But until now, we've understood that as opening up markets and creating common harmonized rules. And I think actually that's a little bit where the problem has come. So it's the how. And I think we need to rethink the how and actually allow much more room for experimentation, for policy divergence, and just accept that that's what is needed politically, but probably also economically. And the role of the WTO is really to sanction violations that cause huge amounts of harm to other countries. So a little bit more of a sort of live and let live rather than trying to get convergence across countries.
Thank you. Thank you. Kimberly?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. Because I think you're right. We have objectives in the Marrakesh Agreement, and when you look at them, those are still very good objectives. They were so forward-thinking, and especially with the sustainable development. And I think it's then the strategy. I think you hit the nail on the head. Where is the strategy to have purely open markets, and how do we understand open markets? And at what point do we draw the line in the sand as this is distorting and it is now a beggar thy neighbor approach? Yes, you're helping your communities, but you're pursuing a beggar thy neighbor approach, which will end up with everyone going less far. Or, and then at what point does that line get crossed? What's the tipping point? And I think perhaps, or probably following the Marrakesh Agreement, there was very much in the space of open markets, pursue those, no intervention, let's try and move everyone along that route. And I do think you're right, the zeitgeist is now changing, is that actually some intervention may not be a bad thing, but it is, I guess, we get into a gray zone, because then there is the point where, for example, if you have very large interventions in the green space, at what point will that alter the terms of competition and innovation? And I think these are areas where, thankfully, we have academics like you helping us think these issues through. But we need to have not just the academics thinking it through, as you well know, we need to have the policymakers debating that and assessing it, and then coming to consensus on where that line is, and then sending those very clear signals to the market as well. So that is where, and then the million-dollar question then becomes, where do they do that? And I think if it's only done at a regional level, again, it sort of defeats the point somewhat. It still has, and so that in that sense, the WTO has to evolve to be able to be asking these types of questions.
Thank you. Just one observation that I have, Kimberly and friends in the audience particularly, we often use the word sustainable development in a very loose fashion, as if it was to concern only environment. Unfortunately, let me disabuse you that sustainable development comprises of the ecology, economy, and the equity. This is, captured in a way by the preamble of the WTO, which was related by all of you. And that is where the problem is. I mean, when you talk in terms of equity, I'm giving you an example. At the special and differential treatment, which is there, the Doha agenda spoke about several issues which the developing countries were difficulty, could not get. Now, special and differential treatment was often used in a best endeavor manner. But if you look at the WTO itself, I mean, the kind of lack of equity, the special and differential treatment in favor of the rich countries was always enforceable. You're looking at textile agreement, for example, or the agricultural subsidies. Those are all enforceable. Those are all special and differential treatment in favor of the rich world. And that still remains a cause of indigestion today as well. And it's the heart of these issues that we often tend to ignore or gloss over that, okay, fine, this is so, what can we do? I mean, our negotiators have banged their heads. I'll give you a simple example. The Doha Declaration also had a clause on discussing and negotiating the built-in agenda. What does it mean, etc., etc. And whenever a point was raised by developing countries in the WTO deliberative committees to discuss it, it was never discussed. No traction ever took place. Even if you look at TRIPS, the Article 2.3b on the life forms, for example, has never been discussed. Now, these are various issues which are part of the lack of equity or inequity in the system, which has to be addressed. And as I said earlier, that this is not a homogeneous world. Benin cannot become Britain even if you give them, 200 years of special and differential treatment. It'll take time. I mean, development takes time, and that is something which often we speak about it with lip sympathy, but we don't understand as to what the problems are. So therefore, even when you talk in terms of non-trade issues, labor or environment or human rights, etc., these differ. Having a job rather than having no job is most critical, and particularly in the current time of the kind of economic decline which is happening in the developing world. You're going to face more and more such problems, and therefore, what do we need? And as I said in my opening remarks, we require kind of a Marshall Plan approach to help the poor countries. Otherwise, we'll have serious human problems. Let me warn you, as it is happening. Yes, indeed. I mean, going back to the initial years of the WTO, it has helped a large number of countries, including India, to come out of poverty. China, India, particularly, are good examples, and many others as well. But what is happening now is that the last quarter, India had a 24% shrinkage in its economy. Can you imagine? 24% shrinkage in one quarter. Maybe, as they say, the forecast is at the end of the year, it may be about 10% shrinkage. As against a growth rate of 6% or 5%, you're having a reverse of a country like India is facing this. So you can well imagine the plight of these smaller countries of the world. So we are in for a very difficult time, and therefore the WTO has to be looked at in the sense that how can it help the economy to revive in a manner that is benign rather than rules based. We can't be always throwing the rule book at others, knowing that I mean, as I said, if you look at the history of special and differential treatment, the Euro round gave all the possible concessions to the rich world as an enforceable, justiciable thing. But what to the developing world? No, not at all. Now, so these are things which we tend to forget, when we get into this. And these are there as the underlying causes of discontent with the system. And not only what is happening currently. That, may I now request Bipul?
Thank you, Pradeep.
Just a minute. Bipul, just a minute. There are a few more questions. Anyway, I'll send these questions to the speakers individually. You could see them on the screen and respond to it a little later. But the moment I think we're coming to a conclusion. We have just about 5 minutes left, I think. About 6 minutes, yeah.
So thank you, Pradeep. I mean, we are coming to the conclusion of this program. I mean, I agree with you, with all of you what you have just said. But in my concluding remarks, I would like to underline a couple of points. One is that first we need to confess that in the decade of 1990s particularly, we made a very big assumption, and that assumption has gone horribly wrong. The assumption was to trust China, to put it simply. Not even trust, but verify. But over the last 2 decades, we have seen that effectively they have made a hostage. The WTO has become a hostage, and it has made a mockery of it over the last 2 decades. So that is something which we need to address. I remember that sometime back, some years back, somebody made a suggestion that we should have a China round of negotiations in order to address some of these issues where there are commitments, but they are skirting those commitments. Now, the situation has come to such a pass, in my opinion, that we are, over time, first we trusted, then trust but verify. Now it is distrust and verify. So that is the crux of the matter. And I think it is because of we are talking about 2 very fundamental different, ideologically different system of economic governance. On the one hand, we have the American system where the private players are the supreme. On the other hand, we have the Chinese system where the state-owned enterprises is just state-led. Now, it's not necessary that, and as a result of COVID, there is going to be much more government we are going to see. We are going to see much more public expenditure. It's not necessarily that they are bad. The dominance is not that bad, but it's the abuse of dominance which is, I would say, bad. So let me conclude by recalling a thesis which has been propounded by one of the eminent scholars of contemporary time, Professor Kishore Mehbubani of the National University of Singapore. When he has written about it in his book on ASEAN Miracle, he talked about and argued that why the Southeast Asian countries, they are so successful in their cooperation. So he said that there are many reasons, primarily three, but one major reason is their distrust. First their fear and then their distrust over an authoritarian managed regime. And that has, I think that is going to force other trading powers, including middle powers like India, to arrive at a new global compact for a better governed multilateral trading system in the 21st century. You have new challenges, as Kimberly has said, in respect to trade finance, in respect to climate change, cross-border taxes. So in order to address those new challenges, we need to have a new system. We cannot address these new challenges of 21st century with rules which were meant to govern trade in the 20th century. So that is something which Mr. Lange, former DG of WTO, he has been talking about in various forums. So we need to think along those lines. I think to conclude, that process has started with the shifting of supply chains away from China. How long that is going to be successful, that is a question and will remain a question for the next few years. But we need to see that while we distrust and verify, how can we, let's say, have some kind of convergence between these two different systemic thinking about economic progress or how to make economic progress. Frankly speaking, I don't have any answer to that at this moment, but we need to keep finding an answer to that question. So thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Bipul. And with that, we would like to now conclude the event and thank Herr Lange, Kimberly and Emily for their excellent presentations and participation in this event. Being recorded live, and those in the audience could also see it at a later stage. Have a good day. Thank you.